Okay, now that we have learned how to mix paint and different ways to layer paint, we've learned that. Okay, we've got our semi-transparent, our imprimatura, thin transparent, and then we have our opaque brushwork level sort of paint. We want to start to apply that to how we start to build a painting. So here we can see we've got a couple designs of landscape, and they're really reduced down to basic three levels of value. You've got your darkest darks, your mid tone, and your lightest lights. So we want to start thinking about building our paintings uh, based on those three areas. And then we add to those later with other values to develop those main areas. But this is what gives us our strong design is when we identify those three main areas. So that's what we're going to do. But we'll also try out two different ways of starting the painting, how to think about applying the paint, and we'll use on the bottom one a concept of the no tone, where we just have black and white. We won't start with black and white, but we'll use that idea of one big solid positive area and one solid negative area. On the top one, we'll go ahead and paint in the individual areas. So we'll kind of see how that works out because there's different ways we can approach this. Artists use different ways. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do, I've already transferred these uh, to my paper. And also, I've gone over them to make sure I can see the outline as I put the paint into the painting. So I have a guide and I don't immediately cover it up. And so what I'm going to do is go ahead and mix my six value scale like we've done previously. And so I'll mix that up by, as we did before, you could start with a rough middle value to kind of give you a beginning um, placement of a value, but we might change that around. I think that's going to be more over here. Okay. And then I'll come in. So I'm going to have basically, if you remember, we'll have three areas of the in the light side. Um, and this is where on the light side you start to move into the dark. And then we have our darks of three values here. And I'll go ahead and mix all those up and then come back. Okay, so here I'm mixing up my six value scale. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 values. Okay. Now, as I mix these, I'm thinking about, well, what middle tone would I want to start with? Because you see, we have these different darks here, and then our darkest tone. So these would be the two darkest areas. These are your two middle, basically, and then these are your light areas. Okay. So what we're going to do is start with just three values to start with, and that will help define um, the, um, the basic design that we want to work with. So that's where you want to really analyze the design. It needs to hold together well. Variety of shapes. You have larger shapes to medium size to small shape areas. This is like the center of interest. So this is the sense of design. We're going to talk about that much more later on in our other classes. But just so we can see how we want to start thinking about the values is really important. So what I'm going to do is take three of these values and bring them out here, like we did in our previous. Okay, and here's my middle value. Now, why did I bring this one out? Because the blackest black, the darkest darks, I should say, the darkest darks are reserved for some smaller areas. So in this case, instead of going with the black and adding light to it, I'm going to go with the darker value, then add a black to it later, or add some dark to bring out the contrast. But I didn't really want to start with the very darkest to begin with. Now, this would be a decision up to each artist how they want to use these values and process them. But I'll show you this idea and give you the reason why. So, so here's my lightest value, but I don't want to paint just pure white. Okay, there's always going to be a little value, so I'll just take a little bit and mix it in here. Now I could start with a little darker value of the light areas and then add white later. It kind of depends on the subject you're painting, what you're trying to accomplish. But these are minor questions that you would ask when you go to do the painting. But basically, we want to start with 3 so that we can just define the major design element. Okay, now I'm gonna, on this top one, I'm gonna go ahead and I'll take this off. Okay, now I've got to decide, I look at the size of the shapes, how big the whole piece is, right? And I got to decide what brush to use. So this brush is kind of small. I'm going to be doing a lot of scrubbing for that. This brush, something in between these two might be good, but this will probably get, I'll probably use this for big shapes, and then I can use a smaller for the smaller shapes to stay within the shapes there as I paint them. My goal is not to paint it like a coloring book where I'm just super concerned about the edge. If you want to do that, you could actually take a really small brush, paint the line, and then fill it in. But that's not what we're concerned about. We don't want to decide ahead of time what all the edges of the shape should be. Some should be softer, some should be harder later on as we do develop the painting. So I'll start with this brush here, and I'm going to, like we did in the previous ones, I'm going to do a combination of the dryer. So this is my Galca gel that will dry the paint faster, but I'll also use a little of the thinner mixed with this in my brush to do the painting. Now what I want to do is, okay, what should I paint first? Well, you could basically almost paint anything as the first thing because you know where you're going with this. But to help us in the future, that middle tone might be the best thing to start with because it kind of establishes what's in the middle, and then you go dark and you go light. But you could do it different ways. There are some artists that just start from the top of the painting and paint down, and that works out well too. But this is how I'm going to do it. So I want to take this middle value. I want to kind of break up the paint so it's going to paint, and I'm going to paint basically a loose, semi-transparent. I don't want to come the first layer and make big, thick strokes. I want to kind of come a little bit thinner, but I don't want it to be just a transparent glaze or something, or like an underpainting. See, so a little bit more thinner. Now, if we were doing an alla prima painting, the meaning we're just trying to finish the whole thing at once, then this should actually be scumbled on, like really uh, more drier paint, so that um, the next layer would go on without mixing into the bottom layer as much. But we're not going to do that on these paintings, so I'm just going to paint them in as if I was painting my first kind of basic layer, a thinner layer. So there's a little bit of transparency to it, but not much. But I want to, I'm staying with a bigger brush and using these edges to paint the edges of the shape. So that's what kind of one of the values to a flat brush. It's got this chisel edge and it allows you to come up and paint those edges. Okay, so there's my middle tone, my medium value to start with. Okay, and then You could paint the light and the dark, but I'm going to go ahead and paint the dark and then paint the light lastly. Okay, so here I go. I'm going to come into my dark. Notice it's not as black. It's not the blackest black, but it's pretty dark. It's enough of a contrast so you can see the difference between those main value areas. And also when you're painting, you want to kind of preserve your brush. If you paint with the brush at an angle and you're not coming in straight and smashing those tips of the brush hairs, that's what will try to spray them out or splay them. See how I can come up to those edges and paint those with the edge of the brush. Okay, so there's that black, and then I can do this other side. Okay, so the brush need a little more solvent so I can come in there. So if it's too hard and it's dry, the paint, so to speak, it's like dragging, then you're gonna have to add a little more gel or solvent. That's why a combination of the gel and the solvent works out to make the paint. Okay, so you can paint it. Okay. Now you see how detailed I can get, pretty detailed with this brush. I come up to the edge and I have enough solvent on the paint. I can come in and do that. Okay. Or you can, switch to another brush. I always add a little bit of that gel so that I know this is going to dry, because actually, depending on the weather, if you don't put the gel with it, this paint will take a few days to dry. So it just takes forever to wait to, if you needed to paint over something. So I just like it so the next day I can come in and paint, or else I'm just going to lose interest. Okay, so a little bit missed up on those shapes. Okay, but that's why we're not overly concerned about perfect edges to start with, because we're going to be fixing that by what's called negative painting. You come in from the other side and you redefine the edge. Okay, that's negative painting. Okay, so now I'm going to go into my lightest value. It's got a lot of gray in it anyway, so that's going to work out. Or that is, say, from the solvent, but that's okay, because I don't really want to start with a super white. So just like when I mentioned that I wasn't going to go with the blackest black, because I'm going to add black later when you add more values to the design. Also with the white, I usually like to go in something's not really the complete whitest white, because later I can add a white to it to have some areas of that pop out, an accent, or just make the lightest areas. Okay, so I'm using my small brush here, and so either one would have worked, but it is easier with the smaller to kind of catch those edges just really carefully. And then down below. Okay, so same thing again. Now what's going to happen is when you come up those edges, it's going to drag a little paint and so forth and give you a little softer feel to the paint. And basically we're kind of looking for that, because that way you get the sense of the brush stroke. Oops. And also at this stage, you can do some correcting and getting, preparing for the next stage by correcting some things that need to be corrected possibly. Okay, then I can go back to my darkest dark, come in and correct that. Okay, so this is a good just little study on on how to start a painting. Now we're doing it with black and white, but eventually it will be with color, and you can start and get the painting painted in there. So this is one way to do that. You can just lay in the colors, or you can even we didn't do it here, but you could, when we use color, you could tone the surface, then come in with your colors, and you see some of the tone coming through. So artists use different methods for this, but this is one way to start the painting. So I'll take these off. You can kind of see it better. Okay, so even with something as simple as this, because it started out looking pretty simple, once you start putting the brush strokes in, it starts to give a little bit more expressiveness to it, just a little bit, right? By just doing that. So there's the basic paint. Okay, so now we're going to paint this one. And instead of using exactly the same process as the above one, I'm going to show you another process that some ways is very helpful in developing the painting, and gives another option of how to process through the painting steps. So here I'm going to put this tape. I have this little 1/4-inch tape that sometimes I use for there, and then tape the edges. I like to tape the edges so that when it's done and I pull the tape, it looks more finished, and I like that because it doesn't look so rough when you see all the paint on the outside of the format. Okay, so here we have the design. We're going to go ahead and paint that in. Now, the way I'm going to think about this now is that instead of thinking of starting with just the 3 values and then putting 3 values in, I'm going to think of what we say the notan, or just 2 values that really defines the main 2-value compositional relationship. Okay, the black and the white to start with. But I'm not going to paint in black, because then in order to paint the middle tone, I'd have to really let it dry, then paint in the middle tone value, because if I paint it in before it's dry, it's going to mix and change the values and so forth. So what I want to do is think of 2 values, but the darker value is going to be this middle tone, okay? And then the lighter value will be this lighter value that we started with. We'll start with just those 2 values. And what I mean by that is I'm going to use this value and paint over all the areas that are both this middle to the dark value. Paint in all those areas first, then paint in all the light areas to start with. Now, so that what that does is really defines the difference between the light and the dark, and helps you to really create a much more stronger design. Because then if that isn't there and it doesn't look that good, or it's overwhelmed by one side to the other, you can correct it at that point. Okay, and then what I'll do is take the bigger brush. Okay, cleaning the brush off, take the bigger brush. And if I look here, I can see that everything on the very darkest dark, these mountains and rocks, and then or the up close rocks and the background mountains, all is one value to start with. But when I paint it, I'm going to paint it so it is transparent enough to see the lines underneath. Okay, transparent enough to see the lines underneath, because later I'm going to be adding color on top of it, or paint on top of it, and I can always make it more opaque. So I'll take this middle value, which is going to be considered my dark no tone value, the positive dark value. I'm going to add the Galkyd gel and the thinner, and I'll just paint over this like this. Okay, and if it's a little bit too thick, I can just go in with some thinner and pull it out. And if that doesn't work, I can always just kind of wipe it down with the rag, so I can see I need to see the design through it. Okay, so the idea is you don't want it super thin, but you want to be able to see that. So I'm going to go all the way into everything. And as I go, I can kind of wipe it down a little bit if I need to. Oops. I don't want to go into the white area, so I'm going to try to stay out of that. Okay, so everything is either the middle tones or the darkest. Now there would be another way to do this, and that is to paint in that big shape and then let it dry, and then draw back into it to identify the smaller shapes. But this just makes it more convenient not to have to do that, especially when the paint's still wet. With acrylic, paint's going to dry, but you do the same thing. You water it down so you can see through. Okay, now I go to my light value, add a little of the gel. Now you can see that it's not super white. It has a little bit of this gray in it, just a little bit, but it's enough difference to you can see the difference. Okay, and then part of the effect here is that we're using this bigger brush, using the brush to define edges like we practiced earlier. So it's not like a little pencil and you're trying to just render in the edge. You're painting up to the edge, and that creates some of the effect of the brushwork, right? Okay, then I go down here, and if I want to, I can switch brush if I want to be a little more accurate with it. Okay, now see, so here's your light area, and here's the dark area. So this is what you would consider your no tone. And as you're seeing the main design relationship, and you might ask the question, do I want to cut this way down and make this shape, this light shape here, smaller? These are some of the issues you'd want to ask yourself at this point. But if you do a little sketch ahead of time, you should have that maybe resolved ahead of time. Okay, so now what I would do, oops, Want to see this outline of this a little better. Okay, so now what I would do is go in and paint the next darkest value. So see, I establish a notan, then I go in and I paint my next darkest value here. Okay, now in order to, and when I say the next darkest, I'd go to this, the darkest next to the very dark, the black. We could number these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, so number 5 value, and I could paint that in. Now, if I paint it in, it's got to be a little more opaque to cover up the paint underneath. But you can do that if you just mix your paint at this point so that it has more pigment in it. And with the gel, oops, so I painted this in. So this is part of the little bit of the issue, but it's okay because we're going to fix things and paint them again better, or correct them is the word I want. Okay, correct them later. So this is a first, you might say, a first block in. That is to say, this isn't the final painting. This is just getting you the main values in there. And then using the reference later, we can do some correcting or shifting a little bit of something areas. Okay, then we notice that this mountain value that's closer to us is a little darker than the one in the back. So now that's where you take these two values and you just mix them together. That's a little bit maybe too dark. I'm taking a look at our reference here. There you go. Once again, you have to make the paint more opaque so that it, but it's not too hard to do it because it's very close in value to what's underneath. And so let's say I, blocked in this painting, but I didn't want to kind of ruin the effect of the brush or overworking it, I should say. So I could let this dry, and then tomorrow, if I've added the gel, tomorrow this will all be dry basically, and then I could do some correcting. Now this brush size is, for me, is a little bit too small for that area, but it's okay. I'm going to be painting over it later. Okay, so there's how we build, starting with the notan, then adding on top of it. And then on the light areas, if there was more values, I could then come in and mix the super light with this middle dark, and I can paint those in. And we slowly go from large shapes to small in our painting, and that gives us the ability to adjust the design as we go. But once again, we should kind of work out that overall design to start with. And so when we're doing the final painting, if we know where we're going with it, we can get it locked in pretty quick. It's going to work real well. We let it dry, we can come back in, and then you could decide if you want more detail or not, and just keep working with the painting to, you resolve it how you'd like. So if we take this off, okay, so there's painted it with this style of painting the sort of note tone first and painting over it. This style is just go in and paint everything directly. They both can work. They're both good processes. Just kind of what you feel more comfortable with and what seems to work to your own